Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jim Hodges. I'm the president of McGuireWoods Consulting. We're pleased to have you here for our Election Insights report on the governors, attorneys general, and state legislative races. In a few minutes, my colleagues will be joining to do a presentation on specific issues as well as specific elections. But before that, let me say a few words about who we are and the work that we do. We are a public affairs firm that has state offices in all of the southeastern states, Virginia through Florida, as well as Illinois, Chicago, in Illinois, both Springfield and Chicago, and Texas, and in California. In addition to that, we have a federal practice in Washington, D.C., an infrastructure and economic development practice, which is primarily out of Richmond but covers the country, and a communications practice that does a variety of communication strategies. It also is a national practice. Where we are unique as well is our service of client needs with various national state legislative associations. We cover the governors associations, Democrat, Republican, and national governors associations. The National Attorneys General Association, including the DAGA and RAGA, the Lieutenant Governors Associations, the National Medicaid Commissioners Group, the National Insurance Commissioners, the various banking commissioner groups around the country, and the National Conference of State Legislators and other legislative groups that cover national issues regarding state legislative issues. So we cover the gamut of issues from federal to state and are a full-service public affairs firm. Before I turn it over to my colleague, Mike Reynolds, I did want to say a word about the national election environment. And first of all, let me promise there will be no chair throwing, no temper tantrums, no insults from my colleagues today. You haven't got to worry about a repeat of the debate Tuesday night. But I think what's particularly interesting here is that the presidential race has been fairly sturdy for months and remains fairly sturdy. As you'll see from the slide that we have in front of you right now, the average, Real Clear Politics average, has Biden a little below 50% and Trump a little over 43. So it's about a 6 to 7 point race. That's been fairly consistent. It's bounced everywhere from 5 to 10. And depending on the poll, but generally speaking, that number has been somewhere in the 6 to 7% range. And my guess is that there'll be a slight uptake for Biden post the debate the other night, but the race appears to be fairly sturdy in that category, and there's been no breakout in one direction or the other beyond that. Quickly, the states to watch in my mind in the presidential race are the states that you know about, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota to some degree, Pennsylvania, those core states that we talk so much about. But I would encourage you to watch very closely Arizona, Florida, Iowa, and North Carolina as states that might be in play more than the pundits suggest. I think those are going to be really critical states to watch, particularly Arizona. Put a big circle around that because it's been moving a little bit more in the Democratic direction, and it'll be a real test of whether or not, how sturdy the strength of Republicans in Arizona is, as well as in Florida, with substantial Latino voting populations. That's a quick overview of the presidential race. We will be doing another a summary of the presidential and federal races here in the next few weeks before the election to update you on that. But let me now turn the program over to my colleague, Mike Reynolds. Mike is going to talk about some specific issues that we think are important in state races around the country. Mike?
Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us. We know that there are a myriad of Zoom call meetings, briefings, and the like that you could be a part of, and we appreciate you taking the time to hear some of our analysis on the various state races and the issues that are impacting folks. As Governor Hodges said before, our practice is very robust, and we have the capability through our colleagues in various state offices to cover just about all 50 states. And we have worked very closely with clients who have issues that pop up, either one-off issues that they need to address quickly and get an answer or seek resolution, or developing a longer-term strategy, either in terms of business development in a new state or finding opportunities to grow and protect their businesses. So we have a very good experience on this. One of the things that we think is most important is not just the top line conversations about who's up and who's down, but actually delving into the issues that impact everyday voters and that impact your businesses. And that is something that we are watching. We're seeing a number of trends on these issues broadly, but here specifically are a couple of those things that are top of mind. Obviously, COVID and the handling of the pandemic, both from a chief law enforcement position from the attorneys general and also from the governor's office. But then there are opportunities that we see surrounding new testing requirements and mandates coming through, research and efforts to find a vaccine, working with higher education and the labs surrounding those areas. Telemedicine has seen an uptick in a lot of legislation and development there, and then also some additional procurement. On the transportation side, we're seeing that the rapid response and EMS management agencies, those sorts of issues, have been seeing greater focus of late, along with the social justice, equity, inclusion, police reform, and criminal justice. These are issues that are biting hard. We're seeing lots of traction with voters, and folks are speaking either to their bases or to particularly suburban voters on those issues to try and reach folks and either talk about it in terms of reforming how we do criminal justice in this country, or specific ways to keep law and order and make sure that folks stay safe. We're seeing an increase in mental health bills that are being filed, and also workforce training. Workforce with the number of Americans who've been on unemployment over the last 6 months at one time or another. That is a major issue, workforce training. And then also in the healthcare space, we're seeing quite a bit of efforts to address various issues such as the cost of prescription drugs and medicines, looking at the pharmacy benefit managers, PBMs, and also the health insurance companies. And as you've seen with the latest conversations about the Supreme Court nominee and that confirmation process that's going to begin in, I believe, about 10 or 11 days, you're seeing more talk about the Affordable Care Act and what that means. And so that's going to have broad impact there. And then finally, there are always opportunities for these particularly new administrations where they're going to be seeking input from the private sector on everything from public-private partnerships, new opportunities to reinvent government, streamline or make efficient, or engage in new projects that they talked about on the campaign trail, and we see lots of opportunities on that. One final issue that we'd like to bring up is energy. We're seeing particularly the Republicans talk a lot about energy independence. Just 3 weeks ago on September 10th, there were 14 governors, 14 attorneys general, and 4 Republican AG nominees who all were talking about energy independence and energy dominance, looking at the low cost of energy. And they're tying these issues into not just your public utilities and things like that, but also as a key message to economic recovery. So that's another issue where you're seeing lots of activity on. I'd now like to turn it over to Scott Binkley and Mona Mohib to go through some of the initial races. Scott?
Well, thanks, Mike. That's a great way to set the table to provide a policy background as we begin to now discuss the political implications of the upcoming election. So to walk through the existing map, there are 11 governor's races this year. 7 are Republican defenses. And I would argue that all of these Republican incumbents are safe, or at least the race has been marked as a lean GOP. Let's begin with West Virginia. Governor Jim Justice is outspending his opponent and is up in the polls there. We've seen a pretty stable race there, and that should be a safe Republican reelect. The same in North Dakota. Governor Doug Burgum is ahead in the polls and should be fine there. One interesting, or I guess I should say two interesting races to look at are Vermont and New Hampshire. Seemingly outside of geographic trends, Governor Phil Scott in Vermont and Governor Chris Sununu in New Hampshire both maintain leads outside of the margin of error and have been doing well in fundraising. On both races, I think they both enjoy such a great position right now, and a lot of that has to do with their handling of COVID. So in Vermont, Governor Phil Scott enjoys a 92% approval rating on his handling of COVID, and in New Hampshire, Governor Chris Sununu enjoys an 88% approval rating on his handling of COVID, and I think we'll see that as we discuss other races that are a little bit closer and how handling of COVID will play into those. The last on the GOP side I wanted to highlight was Utah. So outgoing Governor Herbert was the longest serving governor in the country. And so big shoes to fill in Utah, but Lieutenant Governor Spencer Cox won, as you'll remember, the contested primary there and is in great shape to beat the challenger, Chris Peterson. He'll be a great leader for Utah and was a great lieutenant governor, great man there. So those are the GOP races. Mona, what are you seeing on the Democrat side?
Sure, and as a reminder to folks listening, the way our races work, particularly with the governor's races, is unlike at the federal level where we have a third of the Senate up every 2 years and all the House races up every 2 years. This is not our big 36 race cycle. This is a smaller one. On the Democratic side, we have less defends. We have Washington State, which we feel really good about that. That is the race where Governor Inslee, there's no term limits in Washington State, and Governor Inslee's running for his third term. When he was running for president, there were a number of other Democrats in the state who were interested in potentially making the run, but as he came back to the governor's race, he looks to be very, very safe. So all polling has that as obviously a safe D state. Another defend is Delaware. John Carney, the incumbent who's running for a second term, former lieutenant governor, former member of Congress, running against an attorney, Julianne Murray. All polling leads this to be a very safe seat. I know we're going to talk about this a little bit more in detail going forward. Also feel good about Governor Cooper in North Carolina. It's North Carolina, so it's always a tough state, and we'll spend some more time, but I feel good about Governor Cooper holding that seat. Scott, should we talk a little bit about some of the more competitive? Oh, well, actually, I could talk about the AG races as well. Just on the safe side, feel very safe about General Ferguson in Washington. Feel very safe about Ellen Rosenblum in Oregon. Feel very good about TJ Donovan, who is running for re-elect in Vermont. Also feel, it's Pennsylvania, always a tough state, but feel good about General Shapiro. And I know we'll talk a little bit about General Stein, who's running for re-election in North Carolina. And we can talk more about any of those individual races, but I think overall feel very strong about those.
And I agree, Mona. I think that on the Republican Attorney General side, I think a lot of these races, many are safe. And the ones that are a little bit more of a toss-up right now may go the way of the top of the ticket. And we'll talk a little bit more about Indiana, which may be an exception to that rule here in a minute. But maybe a good time to discuss some more of our closer races. So with that, I might kick it back to Mike Reynolds to discuss Missouri.
Sure. So in Missouri, you've seen a number of things happen here of note. Just in the last, on September 22nd, absentee voting began. You have to give a reason for not voting in person. And just to put this into perspective, why this is such an important data point, in St. Louis County alone, typically they see about 1,000 to 2,000 absentee ballot requests. However, this time they've received over 110,000 requests thus far. So there's a lot of attention on this. Governor Mike Parson was the former lieutenant governor who came into this position after the resignation of Governor Greitens, and he's facing Nicole Galloway. And we're seeing significant funding spent on this. There's $20 million so far that's been spent on political ads in Missouri, about $11 million for Parson to about $8.8 for Galloway. So you can see quite a bit of focus on that race there. Mona?
Sure. Thanks for mentioning Nicole Galloway. She is a tremendous candidate on the Democratic side. She's a great candidate. She's a great fundraiser, as evidenced by the numbers that Mike put out. And she also has tremendous crossover appeal. She's a former Boone County treasurer. She was appointed state auditor by former Governor Jay Nixon in 2015, was elected in her own right in 2018, incredibly popular. This is a race to watch. She, the race originally was lean R, likely R, and has been shifting in a forward motion for her. So definitely folks are paying attention to this race. One thing just sort of to think about is in 2016, Donald Trump beat Hillary. It was about 56 to about 38. So, pretty about 18 points. This time, the numbers are obviously constantly shifting, but Biden is only down about 6. So I think that says something a little bit about sort of what the top of the ticket may do to help. But Nicole Galloway is a tremendous candidate, very popular, and this is definitely a race to watch. It's getting closer, and some might even say the race is in a little getting close to the margin of error, which would make it a really competitive race straight to the end. Another thing on the voting, Mike, I think is also true is there's no longer straight party voting. So folks can split tickets in Missouri, which may play to Nicole's favor.
One final component on Missouri before we switch to another state. In August at the primary, there was a vote for Medicaid expansion via state constitutional amendment, and that makes Missouri the 38th state to pass some form of Medicaid expansion. So as we look at where things stand with the Supreme Court and a possible case before regarding the ACA, Affordable Care Act, that's just a little data point there that should be kept in mind.
Should we move to Montana? Do you want to go first?
Sure, happy to. Thanks, Mona. Happy to. So Montana is really the only open seat right now that is a true toss-up, and so an interesting state to look at. Most recent public polling, the most recent public polling came from New York Times. It's got Gianforte up 6, and I think that the trend line shows a pretty stable lead for Gianforte going forward. Another interesting wrinkle about the state of Montana is their campaign finance limit. So Gianforte has a unique advantage of being able to self-fund. Additionally, in Q2 of this year, Gianforte raised more money than any candidate in Montana governor race history. And so the wrinkle is that it's hard to catch up from a campaign finance deficit because the law caps contributions to a candidate for governor or lieutenant governor at $710 per election. So it's difficult to make up that gap if you're not a self-funder or if you're down on the fundraising race. In addition to that, you've got the U.S. Senate race kind of layered on top. Highly contested between Steve Daines and former Governor Steve Bullock. And so far in that contest, about $45 million has been spent. And so if you're behind in the money race, it may be tougher in Montana to make up the difference. Mona, what are you seeing on the Democrat side?
Yeah, I feel good about this race. I mean, look, it's fair to say that this race is a toss-up. You have Lieutenant Governor Mike Cooney, who's up, and, I think you're right on sort of what the polling is. Look, it's a tight race. I think it'll be tight through the end. Interestingly, it's the media buy in Billings is as expensive as any sort of traditional expensive market, and that really is because of the Senate race that you mentioned. The Daines-Bullock race could be like the race that switches the U.S. Senate over from the Republican hands to the Democratic hands. So there is a lot of outside interests that are paying attention to this race. And the thing about Montana is their voters are renowned for split tickets, so not necessarily all straight line tickets. Another thing is when Governor Bullock, who's incredibly popular in the state, ran for re-election as governor, Hillary Clinton was on the top of the ticket, and she lost to Donald Trump by more than 20 points. The race is different again this year, where the race is, I think Biden, last I saw, was down by about 7. That makes it a different race. But the sophistication of their voters, oftentimes you get a lot of Democrats. We've had Democrats before Daines in the Senate for a long time, between Baucus and Tester and so forth. And it's a toss-up. There's a lot of attention being spent on the state, and I know we're going to talk about the AG's race later, but I think with Governor Bullock, as popular as he is, former Attorney General, now in the governor, and having done well through the COVID, I think that could bode well for everybody on the ticket. And Mike Cooney, of course, being a partner to him, is certainly going to be good.
Yeah, that's a great point. You'd think that Bullock's popularity would help, lift all boats. And to your point, Mona, on Trump at the top of the ticket. So in 2016, Trump won the state by over 20 points. Right now, with him up 7, you can see that the landscape may have changed somewhat.
Definitely. So it'll be a state, honestly, for all of the races to watch. They're all very, very competitive.
Mona, what's your take on the AG race in Montana?
It's really exciting. So Rafe Graybill, who's counsel for Governor Bullock, worked very closely with him, long time Montana, family, in the state. I'm trying to think of Montanian. I'm not sure. I don't think that's exactly the right way to do it. Look, I think this is truly the biggest opportunity for a pickup for the Democrats, and he's well positioned. He's raised more money than I think any AG race in Montana history. He's done a really good job. I mean, obviously, pandemic makes it harder to get around and talk to voters, but I think he's done a very, very good job. And yeah, as we said before, look, this isn't a party line electorate. He's well positioned, and I think because of working closely with Bullock, that helps him. So it's pretty exciting. I think this is the biggest opportunity. One of the things I think that Rafe is doing is he's spending a great deal talking to independents, and I think that's evident in the polling, and talking about health care and all that Governor Bullock's been able to accomplish on that front. He obviously worked part and parcel on that. So the race is a toss-up, but for me, I think this is biggest opportunity for a pickup for the Democrats on the AG side.
And just to put a fine point on this, this is one of 2 of the open seats in the country, Montana and Indiana. The Republican nominee is Austin Knudsen, who was the only 2-term Speaker of the House since term limits were imposed in Montana, and he's currently the Roosevelt County attorney, serving that capacity, doing a lot in terms of drug-related crimes and working on the criminal justice reform, things like that. So he's a young, dynamic speaker, and the Republicans seem to be grooming him for bigger things down the road.
Perfect.
On to North Carolina.
Anything else on? Perfect. Go ahead.
So in North Carolina, this is probably the biggest battleground state in terms of competitive races from the top of the ticket all the way down. You're seeing tremendous amounts of money being raised and spent. You're seeing a key race for the United States Senate, for the governor, and for the Attorney General. Lots of activity taking place. COVID has hit North Carolina, like many places, very, very hard. UNC Chapel Hill, which had opened, went completely online. And just to put a finer point on how competitive this state is, in the last 3 presidential races, it was decided by less than 4 points. So in the last 3 presidential races has been decided by less than 4 points. It's the first state to mail absentee ballots. And just the other day, a federal judge struck down a change to the witness requirement. Right now, more than 1.1 million North Carolina voters have requested absentee ballots on this. There's a total of 7 million registered voters in North Carolina. About 400,000 more Democrats than Republicans are registered. Now, Governor Cooper, and I'll let Mona go into some of his strengths, but he spent 14 years in the legislature. And in the last election, he beat the incumbent Governor McCrory by 10,000 votes. So he outperformed Hillary Clinton by about 3,000 votes. Again, speaking to that cross appeal where he was successful. Mona, you want to talk about the incumbent?
Sure, happy to. Just some more sort of global points. I think, Mike, you hit it spot on, and you talked about vote by mail, and obviously that's a big issue sort of in every state across the country. Democrats, they have an edge in the early voting in North Carolina. There's more than 267,000 Democrats of all the folks who've requested vote by mail. So it's certainly something to factor. Look, I mean, Governor Cooper, former Attorney General, current governor, very popular, doing, I think, is sort of renowned, nationally for the work he's been doing to battle COVID. Look, this is the top race for the Democrats. This is the number one, for all Democrats, incumbents, always taking care of your incumbents is number one thing. Of all the incumbents, this is the top race. But to me, this is really the only place where the coattails actually can go up. I think with his popularity, potentially with him and others on the ticket, I think he actually has an opportunity to help Vice President Biden. But North Carolina is still very much a swing state. As we sort of alluded to, in 2016, Donald Trump won by, I think, it's like, maybe 4%. In 2020, this is going back and forth. Last I saw, Trump was up by 1, which is essentially tied. So this race is going to go down to the very end. I think the Democrats have, a tremendous candidate in their incumbent, Roy Cooper, incredibly popular, has also found opportunities to work together. And I think I think it has to be light blue because it's North Carolina and always will be, but I feel very good about Governor and his reelect.
And just to talk briefly about Lieutenant Governor Forrest, you're seeing a real difference in strategy and how both campaigns are approaching this new COVID crisis, and how do you communicate with voters effectively? Governor Cooper they're in phase 2.5. Gyms and playgrounds are at 30% capacity and things like that. And so he's really refrained from doing a lot of in-person events. Lieutenant Governor Forrest is doing many more of those in-person events, doing some. And the press is taking note of, who's wearing masks, what are social distancing, things like that. And so folks have a very different opinion on how to go about this. This is in part due to some of the coordinated efforts of campaigns. And so you're seeing the Republicans typically across the country. We're seeing this in everything from local races to even the presidential, where there's more of a focus on the Republican side to knock on doors and to do that in-person voter-to-voter contact. On the Democratic side, they're doing more online work, phones even, and trying to get out the vote that way. So it's a very different approach. And we'll see in 33 days which approach prevails. To the Attorney General's race.
Perfect. I was just going to go there. If I can start, we have Josh Stein, who's running for re-election as Attorney General in North Carolina. But of the incumbents, this is a race that the Democrats are paying attention to. It's a tight race, but I think certainly leaning to the AG. This AG race is incredibly expensive. Numbers I've seen are that this race could be upwards of $40 million. And the AG's done a really great job working on a number of important issues, including reforming criminal justice, working on fighting opioid addiction. He's really renowned nationally for his work in tackling sexual assault kits, fighting discrimination, protecting seniors. He's in an incredibly strong position. I think what you alluded to, Mike, about sort of coordinated nature, I think the North Carolina Democrats generally are in very good shape with Roy Cooper at the top of the ticket statewide, and then with Biden on top. I feel good about this race. General Stein's done a really great job, both in North Carolina as part of larger efforts nationally. I feel good, but it's North Carolina, so it's obviously going to be close, and people will be really paying attention to it. It'll be tight, but feel good about the general getting reelected.
And the Republican candidate is a District Attorney, Jim O'Neill. He's from the Winston-Salem area, and he's a seasoned candidate, having run unsuccessfully in the 2016 Republican primary, but he won this year against in a three-way primary. So he's been out there campaigning as well. Again, a tight race. The Republican Attorneys General Association is putting a lot of resources into this race. And it's hard to get oxygen because there's so many folks on the ballot, and there's only so many platforms and media where you can actually get out there. So it'll be interesting to see where there are undervotes, where someone will vote for certain offices but leave other parts of the ballot blank or write in a candidate. That's always an interesting question to see who was able to get their message out in the lead up to Election Day.
Right. And the final point I'll say, just to connect back on General Stein, is because the partnership of working with Governor Cooper and Governor Cooper's positive numbers, I think, will certainly be a benefit for everyone on the Democratic side, including the Attorney General.
Scott, would you like to take the next one?
Sure, thanks, Mike.
So
let's spotlight the Indiana Attorney General race for a minute here. This is, as Mike mentioned, with Montana, the only other open AG race in the country right now. And so, because of that greater focus on the race, you'll remember it is an open race because of the previous sitting Attorney General's misdeeds. He was forced to resign. He was asked to resign, and then Todd Rokita beat him in the Republican primary. So Todd Rokita is the candidate on the Republican side. Everybody in Indiana politics, most in politics, remember the name Todd Rokita. He has been Indiana Secretary of State as well as a four-term congressman. You may also remember that Rokita lost the U.S. Senate primary to now Senator Mike Braun in 2018, and also challenged Governor Holcomb for the steering committee selection to replace outgoing Mike Pence in 2016. So has built-in substantial name ID in the state. But, again, one thing that could drag the AG, Rokita on the AG race would be a potential hangover from his predecessor's misdeeds. All that said, Indy Politics poll from early September has Trump up about 12 and Governor Holcomb up about 20. And so there should be enough pull from the top of the ticket to, I think, get Rokita across the line. One thing to note, and I'll be interested to get Mona's feedback on this. She was mentioning Montana as a split ticket state earlier. I've known Indiana to exhibit the same characteristics. I was on the ground there in 2012, and if you'll remember, Romney won by 5 points. Joe Donnelly, the Democrat for Senate, won by 5 points, and Mike Pence won his race by just 3 points. There were other factors, of course, but to the point on the AG race, Greg Zeller won that year, the AG race, by 17 points. So it's an educated electorate. They have great news outlets in the state, and it should be a really interesting one. Mona, what are you seeing?
Well, I think you've teed it up nicely for me to say, then I feel given the sort of intellect of the electorate, that I feel very good about Jonathan Wines-Apfel being able to become AG. Listen, Jonathan is former mayor, former state mayor of Evansville, state legislator, incredibly, for those who know him, very, very popular. He's in the mode of sort of getting around the state and introducing himself in a COVID world. If the Democrats could get the seat, and he is the right candidate to try to get it, this would certainly be a steal. He is doing really well fundraising-wise, did incredibly well during the primary. He has a long history in Indiana politics and Indiana Democratic politics in particular. And, he said he got into this race because he felt like it was just too tough to sit on the sidelines. And so he is, healthcare is one of his number one issues. Obviously, you mentioned his opponent, Congressman Rokita, who has voted to eliminate the ACA several times, and I think as AG would defend the Republican lawsuit against the ACA, which is coming up right after the election. Healthcare, as I mentioned, big priority, a driving topic for him. The challenge, I think, for Jonathan is that there's really no other competitive seat that's up on the ticket, and that makes it a little bit more difficult. So he is the one that has to perform for himself. I think other things that make it, just complicating is that obviously you have Vice President Pence from Indiana, you have the Supreme Court nominee from Indiana. There's a lot of Republican energy in the state, but Jonathan is absolutely the right candidate for the Democrats. He's doing very well. And again, polling on those who know him, he's doing incredibly well. And, this to me is like the steal. I think he'll do everything he can. But he thinks people are really looking for leadership, and the message of his campaign is really resonating. And, it's definitely, it's a race to watch, and he is definitely a candidate to watch. He's been doing a great job, and maybe those voters that Scott was alluding to will pick him on the ballot.
So in addition to these governor's races and the 10 attorneys general races that we're seeing this year, there's also a number of state legislatures that have elections. Could we kind of talk through briefly what's happening with the state Senate chambers and the state houses?
Go ahead, Scott.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mike. And I'm going to begin with the end in mind here and talk a little bit about why these chambers are so important. Every 10 years, as everyone on the call knows, we go through the redistricting process. And if you remember back to 2010, Republicans flipped 20 state legislative chambers going into that process. And so, and because of the flipping of those legislative chambers, it gave Republicans the upper hand in the redistricting process. So we were able to control the drawing of the lines in states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Florida, North Carolina, and Texas. And this year, as we go into these this discussion on state legislative chambers, as few as 42 seats, not chambers, but seats in these chambers could impact the control of U.S. Congress over the next 10 years. One interesting note is that Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, and Texas are all expected to gain seats, while Michigan and Pennsylvania are expected to lose seats. Whenever that happens, you've got to redraw your lines. You must, because you've lost a seat or gained seats. And so these states are the states where redistricting could have the largest partisan impact. Another thing to note as we talk about these chambers is that if you look back to 2010, the generic congressional ballot was at GOP plus 9.4. So a generic congressional candidate on the Republican side would have a 9.4 advantage going into their race. Today, it's Dem plus 6.2. So 9.4 for Republicans in 2010 when we gained 20 state legislatures. Today, it's Dem plus 6.2. So again, I'll tee it right up for you, Mona. Because of that, what are Democrats excited about this year on the state legislative front?
A lot, actually. And I think you did a really good job of sort of giving context to what happened after redistricting in 2010, obviously Republicans poured millions of dollars into these legislative races. And so I think this year the Democrats are well positioned to take several key chambers back. And since President Trump has been in office, Democrats have flipped, I think it's more than 450 seats, and they've turned 10 chambers sort of red to blue. One, obviously, right in our backyard here of taking control of the Virginia General Assembly for the first time in a generation. And Democrats are really close to taking back you mentioned the Arizona House and Senate, which would be, I think, the first time in over half a century that they've done that. And Minnesota is one really to watch in particular because they just need 2 seats to take back the state Senate, which would then create another Democratic trifecta, having the House, Senate, and the executive branch. So there's huge sort of thanks to demographic shifts that they potentially could flip. The Texas House as well, giving Democrats a lever of power for redistricting. Look, the chances, I think, for the Democrats in state legislatures are bolstered by suburban districts and the trends of what's happening with the sort of constituents and voters there. And so I think the states to watch from my perspective are, we mentioned Arizona and we mentioned Minnesota. I'd also look at the Iowa House. They're 4 seats away. They're 4 seats away in Michigan. I know we have a number of folks from North Carolina, so I have to mention that on the House, they're 6 seats away, and in the Senate, it's 5 seats, so something to watch. Pennsylvania is 9 seats, and Senate has 4 seats to tie. And of course, just for fun, I always like to put Texas in, which is 9 seats to take the House. So I think the Democrats and a lot of folks have been working on the legislative universe and they've been thinking about redistricting for, I think, since the last redistricting, to be thoughtful and organized and prepared. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens. But, the trends are in the right direction, having flipped over 450 seats in the last 4 years. I think Democrats feel that they're trending in the right direction.
And I think that you may be right on that, Mona, that the trend line bodes well for Democrats. One thing that I wanted to highlight was in these seemingly red states, how close we are, and if that trend holds, that Republicans could see some changes. In Georgia, for example, our state Senate is at a 7-seat advantage, but the House is really where the action lies right now because of what Mona mentioned, all of these districts that find themselves in the Atlanta metro area. So in Georgia, the Republicans only enjoy a 15-seat majority, and there are certainly 15 seats to be found in the Atlanta suburbs. And you mentioned Iowa, Mona, only a 3-seat majority in the House. Texas was an interesting one. I know that the Democrats are playing for the Texas Senate and House right now, where in the Texas Senate, the Republicans enjoy a 4-seat majority, and the House enjoy a 9. And again, there are enough metro seats in all of the Texas metropolitan areas to find 9 seats. And so this is a challenge for Republicans. But one thing I did want to note was that just today, the Republican State Legislative Committee, which is the committee that is tasked on the Republican side with these down-ballot races, just announced that they'd raised $23 million for this quarter, which would have dwarfed previous fundraising records. And to put it in comparison, so there's a $23 million announced that they'd raised this quarter. The total that the DLCC, the comparable group on the Democrat side, they've spent $35 million this cycle to date. So it's a huge haul, bolstering their ability to hopefully maintain some of these chambers.
So we've had a number of our clients look to say they have a pretty good understanding of the major issues that are being discussed in the states, and also who's up, who's down, what are the players. But really, in 33 days, we're going to see some new administrations. We're going to see some incumbents be reelected, and our clients want to know how to be best positioned for transitions, the inaugurals, and the upcoming legislative sessions that'll start in January. This is a topic that is fraught with uncertainty, and those who are prepared and are building their messaging and their initiatives right now are going to be better suited than those who wait until December or even January. With a lot of government buildings being closed to the public or restricted access due to numbers, lobbying in the first quarter of 2021 is going to be very, very different. You're seeing a lot of legislatures move into a online format, either Zoom or WebEx or some other format, and that's causing challenges for folks as they look to weigh in either in favor of or against legislation. Same process for regulatory issues. So we wanted to take a minute and just talk about how to prepare yourself. What we've seen is a lot of campaigns as they move from the hard get out the vote efforts to transition planning are looking for and soliciting resumes for new potential staffers who could help out. And then of particular value are position papers on certain issues, definitely in the IT and cyberspace, transportation, how to use funds, education opportunities, procurement opportunities that may not be readily apparent here at this point. Healthcare is going to be a major place for this sort of input. And so if you can be working through those ideas, explain your information in a readily available format that can be handed off to those policy personnel, chief of staff, deputy chief of staff, those sorts of folks, it's very helpful. Mona, Scott, do you have any guidance on ways to prepare for the post-election storm?
Sure. Well, I can start. As a former policy director on a gubernatorial campaign, I was really benefited by building relationships with folks who came in to talk to us about policy issues and so forth. Now, I recognize, as you highlighted, this is a different world. It's a COVID world, but I do think that there's still, whether it's, WebEx, Zoom, et cetera, or phone calls or, social distance coffees, I think, when you're working on a campaign, there are less people than the volume of need that needs to be tackled. So I was really benefited by when people came in and said, or connected with me and said, I really want to talk to you about some policy areas. We want to get your candidates sort of up to speed on. Obviously, candidates have, agendas and things that they care about, but you are always benefited by learning more by people who have policy expertise. So having those relationships are important as you're on the campaign, but then they can become very important post, hopefully, a victory for your candidate, that you've taken the time to build relationships on different policy issues. The staff is, like, as I said, overwhelmed compared to the volume of work. And so you are always benefited by having people on the outside who want to share ideas, who want to give you suggestions. It doesn't mean that you'll take it, but it does mean it can help inform your thought process as you're working on your agenda and then as you're moving forward to try to implement that. So I know that strong campaigns will be taking that into account. Scott, your experience?
Sure, thanks, Mona. And I will echo your comments there that the best place to begin the conversation is on the campaign. And I think that, especially as it relates to open seats, where they won't have the trappings of government around them on day one in office, it's important that they know you and they know what you can offer the new administration on day one. And again, I think that's especially important when you're looking at open seats, and especially when you're looking at candidates that might not have held office before. I think that there will be certain things that they may not have considered. Obviously, they'll have their priorities, but then there's the rest of the cabinet to fill out and down the line. And so, again, build those conversations, build those relationships, and start the conversations on the campaign side, and then continue them through transition, and then hopefully within the new administration.
We now have the opportunity to answer questions if you have about either specific races, what you're seeing overall in terms of the political landscape, or questions about navigating post-election needs that you may have. Any questions? Please feel free to fill out the chat box.
So Mike, let me mention the first one here. This is Jim Hodges. I have two that are in the queue. One is one that was texted in, and the question is a good question. It was whether or not North Carolina and Georgia were the next Virginia, or did they remain solidly red states? I'll take a sort of a crack at that one. I think this election will tell a lot about the direction of North Carolina and of North Carolina and Georgia. Both have the elements that are necessary to become at least purple and perhaps blue, as Virginia now is. And that includes substantial minority populations in both states, particularly African American, urban cores and strong urban and suburban cores. Both states have that, the Atlanta area and multiple areas in North Carolina, and a higher level of college-educated voters than in the other surrounding southern states. They have all those things. The question is whether there is enough to make them move into a truly purple or slightly blue state. North Carolina probably a little ahead of where Georgia is on that, but both states I think are in play in the presidential elections. North Carolina again probably slightly ahead of where Georgia is at this stage, but Scott Binkley mentioned a little while ago some of the challenges in legislative races in Georgia. I think Republicans clearly are keeping a very close eye on the reapportionment process and on what happens in these suburban areas, particularly during this cycle. If the trends continue with white suburban women more strongly identifying with Democratic candidates, clearly that could make a difference in the outcome, not only of the presidential election, but also in these state legislative seats. Final comment about that, I shared this with Mike Reynolds earlier. If you look 25 years ago, candidates were trying very hard to promote their independence and to focus on appeal to independent voters. And independent was not really a dirty word; it was a good word. And I'm of that generation of candidates. And now it seems as though candidates are focused much more on core supporters and base supporters and having messages that appeal to them. And it also seems like voters are looking at candidates as though they're choosing between Coke and Pepsi, that they're choosing Coke from the top of the ticket on down, or they're choosing Pepsi from the top of the ticket on down. And that's a curious change that has accelerated in the past 10 years. So that's one that was one question, and that's a response to it. I'd be curious about how the panelists feel about that, your assessments of North Carolina and Georgia.
Well, Governor, I'm going to defer to the Georgian on this call, Scott Binkley, but one point I do want to make is that there are, if you think about the U.S. Senate, those states all have races that are really on the watch list, right? You have two races for Senate, very uniquely in Georgia, and then you also have Cunningham in North Carolina, who's running a very, very good race and is a potential Democratic pickup against Senator Tillis. So the overlay is that there's a lot of electoral activity going on, which I think might shape the discussion of what's happening in November. So, Scott, I just want to make sure I mention that.
Great point.
Scott, any comments on that?
Gov, I think you nailed it in Georgia, and I think that we were going in that direction as a state beginning before Trump, but I think that the Trump effect has accelerated the change, and I think that, as you mentioned, is most clear in the metro area where those congressional districts and those House districts would be layup for Republicans as recent as 6 years ago, and now they're our most contested in the state. And so, not to say that will change going forward, but I think that might be a reason for the acceleration. And to your Pepsi and Coke analogy, I think that's a great one. And I think that we'll see it more because of that analogy in presidential years, the tightening in Georgia. So if you love Pepsi or Coke, you're going to go out and vote for them. If you hate Pepsi and Coke, you're going to go out and vote against them. If neither are on the ballot, we might go back to a little bit of what we've seen in the past in Georgia, because I think, as you mentioned, we're not quite to North Carolina yet. We're trending in that direction.
I think for our audience, the summary can be: if you like ginger ale, you're screwed in this election. All right, two more. We got a little time left. My colleague from North Carolina, Johnny Tillett, has pointed out that in the House, the Democrats need 6 seats, and in the Senate, I believe, 3 seats. And there also is an open lieutenant governor's race there, which should be quite close. So we wanted to share that with the audience. And there's one other question that's asked for all the panelists here. How can businesses help their employees engage in the voting process in the next month as we close in on Election Day? I'm going to ask all of you to respond to that.
This is Mike. I think to make the obvious point, folks understand that there is an election, and everyone knows that this is about to take place. But the question is, do they actually participate? And companies have to be very careful about this. They don't want to be injecting politics unnecessarily into the workplace. It's a pretty contentious election cycle, and you can run into issues. However, there are just simple things that you can do. If you have a company portal or employee communications, you can put reminders in there to give folks information about how to vote and where to vote, things like that. There are a number of scripts that we have developed for clients, and we'd be happy to share those with you. We did a webinar actually a couple of days ago on this very topic, and have some folks who've been very successful in working with employers to come up with a game plan that is nonpartisan, yet it does show some corporate stewardship that we found a lot of clients feel that participating in their elections, state, local, and federal, is part of their company values of being a good community partner, and that's something very important for a lot of folks. But even something simple as in your department meetings, team meetings, what have you, just having those folks make a pitch to vote either in person or absentee, and really show that the importance, it's not who you vote for, but it's the fact that you participate in this process, because elections do have consequences and they impact everyone.
That's great.
And Mike, you made the great point that it helps your company strengthen its levels of corporate and social responsibility. So it's not who to vote for, but ensuring that your employees are empowered to do so. I think that's great.
All right, I think we have covered all the questions that are out there. We thank all of you for being a part of the program today. I particularly thank our panelists, an outstanding job, and the good questions that we had. We hope you learned something about the state elections that are going on around the country this year. As always, if we can answer any questions, please feel free to email or call us. We're happy to try to see if we can help with questions you might have. In addition to that, these webinar materials will be posted on our website. So for those of you who want to get more detail or go over the details, you're free to do that. Or if you want to share the details of the presentation with friends or colleagues, please do that as well. Thanks for joining McGuireWoods Consulting. We appreciate your being with us today.